Acknowledging, even if it makes you uncomfortable, is how we learn from the past. But how does a community heal from something that affects their culture and well-being so drastically? This is the story of how one of the many BIA-founded native boarding schools in Alaska harbored horrors of abuse for its forced attendees, children as young as 5. The Wrangell Institute was an Alaskan Native boarding school founded by the BIA in 1932 and closed in 1975. With a goal of cultural assimilation, Native children across Alaska were forced into this school and suffered severe mental, physical, and sexual abuse, as well as dehumanizing experiences. The impacts of this boarding school, like many others, is a devastating legacy of trauma, loss of culture, and patterns of abuse. Recently, there has been more attention given to this history, and revitalization is slow yet progressing. This is a history of rights violations, and it shows our responsibility to acknowledge such past, increase education about them, listen to the community, and learn from the past to move into the future with compassion, respect, and understanding. The BIA was founded in 1824 to deal in tribe relations and treaties, which often cheated natives out of their land. In the early 1850s, there was a series of conflicts referred to as the Plains Wars that made the government realize that fighting to gain land would be too expensive. This led them to establish assimilation programs, like boarding schools, in an attempt to erase an unwanted culture. Around the same time, Native nations in Alaska were struck with what they termed the Great Death, where 60% of Native communities were killed in an epidemic of disease brought by settlers that the natives did not have immunity for. The illness caused many of them to see their own way of spirit healing as a failure of their culture and ways, some abandoning them and losing their own identities, accepting brutal treatment from white settlers. The Great Death was a huge factor in breaking down the community and making them susceptible to boarding school initiatives. In 1932, Wrangell Institute was founded in direct affiliation with a local Presbyterian church. Here they were not allowed to speak their language, had their heads shaven, were dressed in Western clothing, and lived in large dormitories. You may have heard this famous phrase before, publicized as a positive aspect of the movement.
Kill the Indian in him and save the man.
This illustrated the boarding school's motives, not to educate, but to destroy. Destroy a whole culture. Based on the UN's definition, this classifies as genocide. A survey conducted in my hometown garnered some shocking responses on both sides of the argument. One of such comments was this one: "It's not my problem, move on." This one: "The past is what is in the past. We can only acknowledge the fact that life was different back then, and what has transpired today is the what we do moving forward. We as human beings are doing everything in our power to have inclusion for everyone." Or this one: "Similar to Juneteenth or tribal stewardship, I wonder where efforts like this end, or how effective they can be. As a country on national topics such as these, can it be effective beyond present generations?" For those who agree with these comments, I urge you to consider something said by a local Presbyterian pastor in an interview I conducted.
It's really hard to hate somebody or to hate a group of people after you've heard their story.
Many of the children at these schools endured a devastating assimilation process that replaced their own beliefs with ones that contradicted their culture.
The superstitions in my family, they go really way back before religion. If you look at the Bible, it'll say something and then the culture will do something different, and then you have to kind of work around that.
Wrangell's legacy specifically highlights the devastating things boarding schools meant for its students.
Was I sexually abused? Yes.
I will never forget it. I was 8 years old. A lot of them were as young as 5 and 6 years old. Some were tethered together on a rope. Shameful kind of thing. We never talked about it. And if we saw a flashlight, this person was coming around, so we tried to make ourselves invisible as possible. I think we've all heard that sound that as a hiccup, but it's gonna go Mama. And then the next child would catch it.
And I think that was the first place I felt shame.
Nobody held us in their arm and let us be little kids.
One of them pulled my pajamas down and the other one was holding me down so she could whip me.
There doesn't have to be any buildings here to see what we remember.
There are accounts of little girls going home pregnant at ages as young as 11. One attendee of the school illustrated the dehumanizing nature of their experience with one shocking sentence: "I thought my name was my number." When placed in Wrangell, each kid was given a number, which were often used as a replacement for their names, and this child, like many others, began to believe that this was his only name. Another clue as to the horrors these children faced is in the language they used to discuss their experiences. Many would not say that they graduated, but merely that they survived.
We survived. We made it. We got out of there.
They also reminisced on their friends that didn't survive the school.
Many of them have committed suicide. Many are alcoholics today. A lot are in prison.
The state records show that there were 0 deceased students at Wrangell, but through these and other experiences of people that lived it, we know that that's not true. So far, we do know that at least 31 children died at Alaska boarding schools, but many have gone undocumented. Along with this, many who did survive the school ended up with severe PTSD, depression, or other mental health problems as a direct result of their experiences. These conditions not only affected them, but have also affected their descendants. Rates of suicide, drug addiction, and alcoholism are much higher in Native communities today, and many still face the effects of their cultural loss to this day. In the survey given, I received 156 responses. Among these were messages discounting these events, but also bravery from the Native community to share how Alaskan boarding schools have affected them, like this message. The older women in my family were and are traumatized by their experiences, and they are shy and meek in their personality and confidence. Or this one. I've lost at least 3 family members to the generational trauma of boarding schools. The cycle needs to be broken with support and hope for families that keeps them together and provides them with positive Native role models. Or this one. My mother was sent to a boarding school, and what she went through haunted her until the day she passed away at the age of 46. Or this one. I think my grandpa attended a school in Barrow. The teachers were strict. I know the kids were not allowed to speak Inupiaq while in class, and were slapped on the hand if they did. This led to a lapse in the language, and my grandpa forgot it. He also wasn't allowed to write with his left hand. I was careful when constructing a survey on such a heavy topic, and made sure it was clear that they only had to share to the degree they were comfortable with. Some I noticed simply clicked that boarding schools had directly affected them, with no explanations.
For sure, I've seen, it's a really, tough subject to talk about.
Their communities and culture were drastically affected by boarding schools. My Native friend expressed that she didn't know hardly any of her native language, and many languages were completely lost through the boarding school system.
So I don't really know any of my language. I don't know, either Athabascan or Yupik or Chupik. Neither does my dad, but all of my uncles and aunties know, and they're slowly starting to use that more. I see that slowly coming back.
I think the loss of language is probably the biggest piece of evidence that there's a legacy here. Not only was it not taught, it was actively shamed out of people. There's shame associated with that, and that's terrible.
However, through the lens of all this darkness, there is reflected a way to move forward and keep it from happening again, and to learn from the past. To be more mindful about how boarding schools have affected those around you, to uplift their voices. The revitalization is a slow process, but it is happening, and we must continue down this path.
It isn't only pain. We don't only wallow in pain. It's just that we've never had an opportunity to tell it.
You can't go back to change it. The next best thing is to apologize and say you're sorry.
Now we could sing our language all we want. Hoo, hoo, hey!
We must teach our children about it in schools so they can continue to listen. In my survey, I had 2 burning questions. Have others noticed that it's not taught in schools, and why isn't it? Under the question, did you feel the curriculum and AK studies covered everything? These were the results. The dark history of boarding schools like Wrangell has caused a deep-rooted pattern of abuse and pain. As one person put it in the survey, we are all affected by the Alaskan history and genocide of our people. Cycles of violence are handed down generation to generation like recipes and heirlooms. Everyone who has been taught to cope with grief and stress in their lives with alcohol affects our community. We should continue to listen because there are many more stories out there. One cannot simply move on from such pain. We must acknowledge it first so we can keep these schools from taking any more lives than they already have.
I've definitely encountered folks who knew that God loved them, but also that the church maybe had failed them in some ways. They thought that would be the entity that would maybe defend them or help them to stay with family in their home village. That didn't happen. The roles that the church has played in history, both good and bad, often a partner with nations into colonialism. Obviously, there were abuses that took place there, and that's worth acknowledging and repenting of. God wants us to tell the truth. These people have this other value, and you can listen and learn and respect that. Never be afraid to tell your story. For everyone else, don't be afraid to listen. It can be uncomfortable. It's okay, especially if embracing that discomfort allows you to fully listen to somebody. Listening and sharing is going to be the way forward.
My uncles and aunties, they didn't go through the best experience. In Athabascan culture, you're supposed to respect the person. Teachers using rulers have their hands out and smack them. And my parents keep that generational break they keep it from us. I know some families, it's kind of hard to do that. It's something that you would see for sure in like a movie, but like it definitely happened. I would like to see more people knowing about what happened in the boarding schools. Having your culture and being able to know who you are is really, really important, and one of our biggest aspects here at Mount Edgecombe. My story is very different from my elders. I feel like they'd be happy to see that boarding schools don't mean very terrible things anymore.